The cassette tape clicked to a stop, and Dean Martin stood frozen in the dressing room with tears streaming down his face. Wait. Listen to what that dying man recorded just hours before his heart gave out, and you'll understand why Dean couldn't hold the microphone that night. The woman standing in front of him was maybe 45, wearing a black dress that looked like it had been pulled from a closet in a hurry. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and she had driven 300 miles through the Nevada desert to hand Dean Martin a small plastic rectangle that weighed almost nothing and meant almost everything. "My father recorded this the morning he died," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was past shaking. "He was getting dressed for your show. He'd bought tickets 6 months in advance. He said seeing you live was the only thing left on his list." Dean looked down at the cassette in his hand. The label was handwritten in trembling script, "For Dean, from Walter." The ink had smudged in places, as if the hand holding the pen couldn't stay steady. "He never made it to the show," Margaret continued. "Heart attack in the hotel lobby. They said he was already gone before the ambulance arrived." The dressing room at the Sands Hotel suddenly felt smaller. The lights around the mirror seemed too bright. Dean could hear the orchestra warming up through the walls, the muffled brass and strings that usually made his blood move faster. Tonight they sounded far away. "Play it," Margaret said. "Please, I need you to hear what he wanted to say." Dean's fingers found the portable player on his dressing table. He slid the cassette in and pressed the button. What came through the tiny speaker would stay with him for the rest of his life. Notice how silence can be louder than any applause, because in that moment, even the orchestra seemed to stop. The voice was old and tired, the kind of voice that had seen too many doctors and swallowed too many pills. But underneath the exhaustion there was something else. A brightness, almost like a boy getting ready for Christmas morning. "Mr. Martin," the recording began, "my name is Walter Holloway. I'm 73 years old, and I've been listening to you since I was 42. That's 31 years of your voice keeping me company." Dean sat down on the small couch. His legs didn't feel trustworthy anymore. "When my wife died, I played your records every night for a year. When my business failed, I played them louder. When the doctors told me my heart was giving out, I made a decision. I said to myself, Walter, before you go, you're going to see Dean Martin sing in person, just once." The tape hissed for a moment. Walter was catching his breath. "I wanted you to know that your voice, your songs, they got me through the darkest nights of my life." Dean's hand moved to his face. He didn't realize he was crying until he felt the wetness on his palm. "Tonight, I'm going to sit in that audience and watch you sing, and I'm going to feel like the luckiest man in Nevada. So thank you, Mr. Martin. Thank you for 31 years of keeping an old man's heart beating when it wanted to quit." The tape went silent. Then, impossibly, Walter Holloway began to sing. "Remember this. Remember a dying man singing in a hotel room at 6 in the morning, knowing he might not live to see sunset, choosing to spend his final breaths on a song. It was, 'That's Amore.'" Walter's voice cracked on every high note. His breath gave out in the middle of phrases. He forgot some of the words and hummed through the gaps, but he sang it all the way to the end, and when he finished, he laughed, a short, breathless laugh that sounded like pure joy. "See you tonight, Mr. Martin. Save a good note for me." The tape clicked off. Dean sat there for a long time. The orchestra had finished warming up. Someone knocked on the door and said 15 minutes. He didn't answer. Margaret Holloway stood by the door watching him. She hadn't cried once. She'd probably done all her crying in a hospital waiting room somewhere or on the long drive through the desert. "He was smiling when they found him," she said quietly. "The hotel manager told me. He said my father was walking toward the showroom doors with the biggest smile he'd ever seen on a guest." Dean stood up. Something had changed in his chest. Something had locked into place. What was his seat number? Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry." "Your father's seat. Where was he supposed to sit tonight?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled ticket. Row 3, seat 7, right in the middle. Dean took the ticket and looked at it, close enough to see every expression on his face, close enough to feel like they were in the same room together. "Stay here," he said. "Don't leave." He walked out and found the stage manager, a nervous man named Polly, who always smelled like cigarettes and worry. "Polly, I need you to do something. Row 3, seat 7. I want it empty tonight. Put a rope around it, put a sign on it. I don't care, but nobody sits there." Polly's face wrinkled. "Dean, the show's sold out. That seat belongs to... The man who bought that seat died this morning trying to get here." Dean's voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "That seat stays empty. Look at a man making a decision that doesn't make business sense, that breaks the rhythm of how things are done. Look at what happens when someone decides that honoring the dead matters more than filling the house." Polly nodded and disappeared. Dean walked to the stage entrance. Through a gap in the curtain, he could see the audience settling into their seats. Women in evening gowns, men in suits, the clink of glasses, and the murmur of expectations. They had paid good money to see Dean Martin be charming and effortless. He wasn't sure he could give them that tonight. The opening act finished. The house lights dimmed. Dean heard his cue and walked out onto the stage with the smile he'd worn 1,000 times before. But something was wrong, and the audience felt it immediately. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at row 3, seat 7. The empty chair with a small piece of paper that said, "Reserved for Walter." "Good evening, everyone," Dean said into the microphone. His voice was smooth as always, but there was a crack underneath it. "I need to do something a little different tonight." The room went still. This wasn't the Dean Martin they expected. "There's an empty seat in the 3rd row," Dean continued. "The man who was supposed to sit there died this morning. His name was Walter Holloway. He was 73 years old, and he drove across 3 states to see this show." A murmur rippled through the audience. A woman in the 2nd row reached for her husband's hand. "Walter recorded a message for me before he died. He wanted to tell me what my music meant to him. And then, and this is the part I can't get out of my head, he sang to me. A dying man, alone in a hotel room, sang me a song." Listen to what happens when a performer stops performing and starts being human. Listen to the shift in the room when the mask comes off. Dean took the microphone off its stand and walked to the edge of the stage. People in the front row could see his eyes glistening under the lights. "I've sung That's Amore maybe 5,000 times in my life, but Walter Holloway sang it to me this morning from somewhere past the edge of his own life, and I want to tell you, I never really heard that song until today." He turned to the orchestra. "Fellas, let's do this one slow. Let's do it like we mean it." The strings began, gentle and patient. Dean lifted the microphone and didn't look at the audience. He looked at the empty seat. He sang it differently than he'd ever sung it before. Every word was a conversation with someone who wasn't there anymore. The audience didn't move. They didn't sip their drinks or shift in their seats. They were watching Dean Martin grieve in real time, using the only tool he had. Wait for the moment when Dean's voice catches and he almost stops. It happened on the line about holding someone tight. Dean's throat closed for just a second. Not long enough to ruin the song, but long enough that everyone knew. The orchestra carried him through the gap, and he found his voice again, but the damage was done. He was just a man now. When the song ended, the room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then the applause started, and it wasn't polite clapping. It was something raw, something that came from a place people didn't usually access in a Vegas showroom. "I want you to remember Walter Holloway," Dean said. "Music isn't just background noise. It finds people when they're hurting. It sits with them in hospital rooms and empty houses. It keeps them breathing when they've forgotten why they should." He paused. "Walter drove 300 miles to hear me sing. He didn't make it. So tonight, every song I sing is for him, and I'm asking you to help me. When I look at that empty seat, I want you to imagine the happiest man in Nevada sitting there." The audience said yes, not with words, but with a shift in how they held themselves. Notice how a room full of strangers can become a congregation when someone gives them something to believe in. Notice how Dean Martin transformed a Vegas casino into a chapel. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. The rest of the show was unlike anything Dean had performed before. He told real stories between songs about his father, a barber who never understood why his son wanted to sing, about the first time he froze on stage for 30 seconds before finding his voice, and always, always he looked at the empty seat. During Everybody Loves Somebody, a woman in the 5th row started crying. Her husband put his arm around her and Dean saw it happen, and he nodded at them. During Return to Me, a man in his 60s stood up from his table and held his hand over his heart. He didn't sit down until the song was over. During the final number, something extraordinary happened. Dean had chosen You're Nobody Till Somebody Loves You. As he sang it, looking at Walter's empty chair, the words transformed. Remember that Walter Holloway had spent 31 years loving the voice coming through his radio. Remember that love doesn't require the beloved to know it exists. Dean finished the song and the lights came up for his bow, but before the audience could rise, he held up his hand. Walter's daughter is here tonight. Margaret, will you come out here, please? The audience turned to see a woman in black walking toward the stage. Dean reached down and helped her up. Margaret drove 300 miles to bring me her father's message, Dean said. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted me to hear what Walter had to say, but I think Walter deserves more than that. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the cassette tape. I want you to have this back, he said to Margaret, but I want to give you something to remember tonight. He turned to the orchestra. One more time. That's Amore. And this time, I want everyone in this room to sing along. The music started, and Dean sang the opening line. But by the second verse, 300 voices had joined him. The Vegas showroom became a chorus. Margaret Holloway stood on the stage with tears finally falling down her face. She was hearing what her father had wanted to hear. She was watching strangers turn her grief into something beautiful. Look at her face. Look at the moment when loss becomes legacy. Look at what happens when one person's love spills over and fills an entire room. Later, after the crowd had filed out, Dean sat alone in his dressing room, with the lights turned low. There was a knock. Margaret Holloway entered, still wiping her eyes. I don't know how to thank you, she said. Dean shook his head. Your father thanked me. 31 years of listening. That's more than I deserve. He would have loved tonight, Margaret said. He would have said it was worth dying for. Dean flinched at the words, but then he understood. For Walter Holloway, this was exactly what he had wanted. Not to witness something perfect, but to be part of something true. I'm going to do something, Dean said. Every show I do from now on, I'm going to leave one seat empty. I'm going to call it Walter's seat. And every night, I'm going to sing one song for whoever should have been sitting there. Margaret stared at him. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious in my life. And he meant it. For years afterward, Dean Martin's shows featured an empty chair in the front section. The regulars knew what it meant. The newcomers learned. It became a legend, the seat that Dean Martin kept for the ghosts. Once, a new stage manager tried to fill the seat during a sold-out show. Dean stopped mid-song, pointed at the young man who had sat down, and said calmly, That seat is taken. Find another. The young man moved. The stage manager was fired the next morning. Listen to what remained after that night. Listen to how one man's death taught another man how to live with more intention, what Walter Holloway had done without knowing it. Dying on the way to a show, leaving behind a tape full of love and a dying man's song, had changed something fundamental in how Dean Martin understood his own work. Music wasn't a product. It was a bridge between people who might never meet. Remember what Walter said, Your songs got me through the darkest nights of my life. Somewhere in the world, right now, someone is lying awake in the dark, and the only thing keeping them company is a song. That's what the empty chair taught him. Years later, a journalist asked Dean about the strangest moment of his career. Everyone expected a story about Frank Sinatra or some scandal from the golden era. Instead, Dean talked about Walter Holloway. "A man I never met changed my life," Dean said. "He sang to me while he was dying, and it was the most beautiful performance I've ever heard. I've been trying to live up to it ever since." The story spread. People started sending Dean their own stories, tales of his music getting them through illness, divorce, loss, despair. He read every letter. Each letter was another Walter. Each writer was another person who had reached across the darkness and found something to hold on to. Look at what one cassette tape started. Look at how grief became gratitude, became legacy. Margaret Holloway lived until she was 92. In her final months, she finally played the record Dean had sent her decades ago, a live recording of that night at the Sands. Her grandchildren sat with her and listened. They heard a voice telling a story about a great-grandfather they'd never met. They heard 300 strangers singing. "That's your great-grandfather, Walter," Margaret told them. "He loved music more than anything, and he taught Dean Martin how to love it properly." The grandchildren didn't fully understand, but Margaret saw something flicker in their eyes when the record played. A recognition, an understanding that some things were worth dying for, even if you never got to experience them. That was Walter Holloway's real legacy, the proof that love could outlast the body that held it, that a man could spend his final breath singing a song and have that song carry forward through decades. Listen one more time to what Walter said. "See you tonight, Mr. Martin. Save a good note for me." Dean Martin saved more than a note. He saved a seat. He saved a story. He saved a way of understanding what it meant to give yourself to music completely without reservation. And somewhere, perhaps Walter Holloway finally got to hear it. The showroom lights dimmed for the last time. The empty chair remained exactly where it had always been, waiting for someone who would never arrive, but whose presence had never really left. That's what music does. It holds space for the absent. It gives voice to the silent. It keeps singing long after the singer is gone. If you want to hear about the night the cops showed up at Dean's dressing room asking about Walter's death and what they found that changed everything, let me know in the comments.